Welcome back to Inside the Studio. It's been 3 years. What a great time to bring back the show when we all have so much time on our hands looking for something to do. My name is Evan Sanford, and it's been 3 years since I last hosted the show. Lots happened for me in the meantime. Now I'm in Palm Springs producing the 11 o'clock news at the ABC affiliate station. And the University of Redlands asked if we'd bring back the show and talk to some alumni and friends of the university and see how we're all doing in these difficult circumstances. I hope you're all being safe and continuing to be healthy with your family, staying at home. But we have a very special show today, and my guest is Lieutenant Colonel Billy Pope. He is a graduate of the University of Redlands from 2001, and he's also got a new job title since the last time he was on the program. He is now assigned as the Chief of Future Operations Division at the headquarters for the United States Cyber Command. Lieutenant Colonel Billy Pope, welcome back to the program.
Thanks. It's great to see you.
So before we get to some of those issues, how is your family holding up during these difficult times?
So we're doing well. We're out here in Maryland. That's where the United States Cyber Command headquarters is. And like most states, of course, Maryland has experienced its own significant set of impacts from businesses and schools and health concerns, of course. But all of us, thankfully, are together. We're healthy and we're happy. Our family is doing well.
Do you personally know of anyone that's been affected by this pandemic?
So I think the social circles are enormous, right? So I think everyone has connections at this point that have either been impacted personally or through a secondary connection have actually had the virus. We've certainly had instances here, and it hits relatively close to home. My wife is normally she's a nursing assistant in the schools here in Maryland. But because of the school closure, she's actually been kind of drafted to be part of the COVID testing program. So she is actually out helping the nurses and the frontline supervisors or the medical personnel doing the testing every day. So certainly not something that is foreign to us as she works through the very real circumstances of the virus itself.
Does she have everything that she needs in terms of that protective personal equipment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's been an extraordinary ramp up over the last few weeks where you could see that people were putting together the different pieces of the public mechanisms that they needed to respond. But then as resources started to catch up with the need, you could see the systems that make America great or make America what it is really kind of take root, and the supply chains have really caught up, and the personal protective equipment and all those kinds of things that they need are in place, and they're really doing well.
So let's talk about your new job title. It sounds very exciting. What are some of the things that you're currently involved with at Cybercom?
Oh my gosh, well it's a huge mission and an important one. With the exception of the U.S. Space Force, the Cyber Command is really the nation's newest sector or newest area within the national defense circles. And it's an extraordinary mission with amazingly talented people where we get to work closely with all the branches of the military, with our interagency partners, both in the intelligence community and elsewhere, all across the entire government, as well as working closely with private industry to defend the nation against cyber attacks.
What's your favorite part of that new job title that you've been able to move into?
The chief of the Future Operations Division. I don't know. I mean, I may be a little biased, but it's if you're working in an area that is focused on the future and focused on persistent innovation, to be able to run the team that's in charge of developing and charting our course through that innovative environment is a pretty fantastic opportunity. So if you were to ask me what my favorite part of my job is, I'd say it's the entire thing. It really is the culmination of a lot of academic work that I've been able to put together, including time at Redlands all the way up until now, professional experiences as a military strategist, and now really working on something that is fundamentally important for the United States. It's a pretty tremendous opportunity.
So let's talk about some of those things that you tackle in your everyday job. What are some of the things that adversaries to the United States are doing to undermine national security? What would you be involved with as it pertains to that?
Yeah, first I would just kind of go back to what our mission is at Cyber Command. So the mission that we have is divided into three different areas. First, we're charged to defend the Department of Defense's information networks, right? And so that is an enormous architecture of information technology that expands across the world with touch points in almost every country, as you can imagine, all the way into outer space and below the surface of the ocean and in the far reaches of the planet. And so that terrain is one that is complex and difficult to defend. So we're charged to defend that from attacks. Additionally, all of our deployed combatant commanders around the world, we call them. So those are our warfighting commanders in the different services that are charged with defending the nation's interests, both at home and abroad, depend on cyberspace for different capabilities. And so we are charged to support them in providing the capabilities they need. And then, thirdly, we are the agency within the United States government and the Department of Defense that is charged with defending the nation and our critical infrastructure and giving us the ability to withstand and respond to cyber attacks. So you can see that just the scope of the mission from within the DoD or the Department of Defense specifically, and then as it expands across the entire swath of our nation, is pretty tremendous. So that's really what we've been focused on. But to your question about what are some of the things that our adversaries are doing to try to inflict harm in that space, I think I take it back to, you can see the changes in society that have taken place over the last, at a minimum 10 years, where we have become increasingly dependent on cyberspace and that ubiquitous connectivity for everything we do, right? From transportation networks that book passengers on airplanes and manage our rail systems, to the critical infrastructure like our energy grids and our water systems, to just the connectivity like we enjoy today. All of those things have changed the fabric of society, right? And we've become increasingly dependent on those types of systems in order to function like we do. Yet at the same time, the technologies that underpin a lot of those capabilities are sometimes legacy technologies that were not built with security as the foremost consideration. Many of them were created in ways that allow connectivity over security. And so they present new threats. And so as a military strategist, when you look at it in terms of something you are dependent upon, but potentially vulnerable within, that's a dangerous combination. And our adversaries haven't ignored that fact either. We have sophisticated adversaries that are looking to leverage that dependence on information technology and the systems that make up cyberspace and our potential vulnerabilities within it. So that's kind of the scene setter in the space. And for a lot of years, as we were trying to decide what was acceptable within this space and where the United States' position would be in terms of conflict within cyberspace, we found ourselves kind of like a boxer in the corner, just trying to absorb blows and survive in a defensive crouch. But I think just with new authorities and new capabilities that have been given to the command, we've been able to kind of reverse that and put ourselves into a posture of what our commander calls persistent engagement, persistent presence, where we are in constant contact with adversary nations and non-nation state actors within this space every single day, imposing costs and making it difficult to bring harm to the United States in cyberspace. And so those are the competitive situations that we find ourselves in. Adversaries that are trying to leverage this space to undermine the United States' strength and potentially hold us at risk. We're removing those advantages and putting ourselves back onto a posture of strength.
So going back to what you mentioned about persistent engagement with persistent force, what kind of partnerships do you have to have with different agencies to accomplish that goal?
That's everything. I'll tell you, cyber conflict and cyber operations is a team sport. Across the government, you've got the intelligence community that informs the threat that we face every day. Extremely close partnerships with the National Security Agency and with the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, and several other agencies that work to help uncover and paint the picture of the adversary that's important to us. But that it doesn't stop there. Really, our ability to create leverage in cyberspace is contingent upon a whole of government approach that includes the Department of Homeland Security and Department of State, Department of Treasury, and several others that make up that cohesive element of strategy that brings the nation's power together. But certainly not just across our own government. We work very closely with allies, in the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, right? Where if we can strengthen our allies and make them less vulnerable to cyber attacks, perhaps more capable of maneuvering and really thinking within the space, then we can make our own nation stronger and decrease the relative strength of our adversaries. So working with our own government, working with allies, and then the third piece, of course, is our very close partnership with industry. Almost everything we do in cyberspace from a Department of Defense perspective is either closely tied to or contingent upon capabilities from the commercial sector. So you've got the enormous conglomerates from Microsoft and Google and Amazon and everybody else that really makes up the fabric of the internet and cyberspace as we know it. We have to work in close concert with them if we're going to be successful. So we depend on partnerships, both in terms of the formal kinds you would expect, but also in less formal ways that are absolutely essential to our success.
So with all the attention that coronavirus is getting, lots of focus is also being paid to the 2020 campaign and what kind of impact that will have. So can you talk to some of the about the things that you are preparing for, and if you can, I know a lot of what you do is secret, but if you can tell us anything about what you're thinking of and planning for worst case scenarios, that would be so interesting.
Sure. So as you said, the COVID emergency really is changing the fabric and the strategic approach of the nation toward the election. And so there's certainly some decisions that are kind of working through the federal government now in terms of what the election will look like. Is it going to consist of in-person voting? Will the virus condition allow for those types of things to take place? Are we going to be more dependent upon a mail-in ballot type of an environment? Those are all decisions that are certainly outside of the realm of Cyber Command and are within the larger federal government to consider. But it's our job to adapt to those circumstances. And so we're watching very closely as the federal government puts together its response and how it plans to approach the 2020 election, knowing that that's our command's number one priority, and it remains so as the defense of the 2020 election. I can tell you generally, we look at threats to our election through two different lenses. First, it's looking at the potential that an adversary could interfere with the election. And what we mean by that specifically is that they would tamper with the voting systems or the voting counting or the mechanisms and IT infrastructure that allows us to conduct the election. And that is a paramount concern, of course. So we have a laser focus on the different systems and dependencies that allow our election to go off, both logistically and in terms of allowing the American public the opportunity to exercise their constitutional right to vote. So we are keenly focused on anything that points to signs of interference in our elections. And then the second half of that equation, of course, is we're watching closely for efforts to influence the American people. I talked a lot at the beginning about the systems side of this, but this is a social problem as well, right? We've seen where adversaries have seen our dependence upon these types of mediums that we're using today and our own social connectivity to be a source of leverage against the American people. It's our job to try to point out those sources of influence, impose costs on adversaries that choose to use this potential point of leverage so that we can reinforce the integrity of the election itself and the processes that go into electing our next president. The definition of success for us is we wake up on the day after the election, or frankly, even beyond into when the new president or the newly elected president is inaugurated. And we say, you may not agree with the outcome of the election, but that by and large, the American people see the election as one that was legitimate, and it was the product of genuine votes as opposed to foreign interference or influence.
Got it. So your boss testified before the Senate Committee on Armed Services last year. Can you talk about what that was like to see them on TV, and were other people in your department watching, and what was it like to hear the questions being asked and the responses?
Oh yeah, well certainly I can say, well, so General Nakasone is a regular on Capitol Hill, as for better or worse as a combatant commander. He spends an awful lot of time talking to, advocating for our mission, and also kind of telling the story for the resources we require, and also the successes we've had. So that's familiar terrain for him in the command. I've also had the opportunity to go to Capitol Hill several times and testify, not necessarily to that scope at all, but to the staffs from our senators and our professionally elected officials. And I can tell you that we have a generation of staffers and even elected members of Congress who grew up as digital natives, right? And they embrace and know this environment better than anyone. And so we are constantly impressed with both the aptitude and the level of understanding that we encounter when we go to Capitol Hill. We've had fantastic support as I think both the American people and as the government realizes the threats we face and the gravity of those threats within cyberspace. We have received almost everything we ask for and more in terms of resources and the authorities and the approvals to do what we need to do to defend the nation in cyberspace. So certainly part of the job when you see the boss on TV talking with Congress and defending where we are, but it's also an area that you can see the nation's interest in it, and you can see how tuned in people are to the mission we do.
Speaking of people tuning in, we have a question that we want to get to. So this is from Arthur. One threat during the last election was the hacking of party systems and stealing of data. Are you working with political parties to secure their systems? Can you speak to the measures that are being put in place to secure those systems?
Certainly. A lot of, so this is a dynamic mission space. I talked about our partnerships at the beginning. Of course, the Department of Defense's mission is externally focused. We're looking at threats that come in against the United States from external entities. And that becomes kind of an interesting equation when you're talking about a foreign adversary that manifests itself on systems within the United States. It's kind of at a convergence of two sets of authorities. And so when you're talking about systems within the United States that could potentially be compromised, that's an area where we would work very closely with the FBI and others to coordinate the strategy there. Now, that's not something that we do responsively. It's something that we are very much engaged in proactively. So these are all of the kinds of conversations. And there's, if we were to look at party systems, but then you can also look at the infrastructure that connects, voting systems. You can look at an enormous number of variables that connect all the pieces together to bring the election to bear. We're looking at all of those, not necessarily trying to defend them all, but trying to understand where the adversary is active and then focusing our defenses against the strategies that they plan to employ against us. And so if you look back at the results of the 2020 election, the 2018 elections, I think you'll find an example of where we've changed from a posture of sitting back and defending to one where we're really focused on what the adversary is capable of and what they plan to do, and then where we can employ our capabilities to defend the election. So 2018 was 2 years and a lifetime ago in terms of our understanding of this space, and I think we are well postured for the 2020 fight.
All right, so let's move to your time at Redlands. How did you even get to Redlands? Was it a college counselor? Did you have other people in your family that came to the university? How'd you end up at the University of Redlands?
Oh gosh, well, so I grew up in Southern California. I grew up in the desert, just north of the Inland Empire. And if I go all the way back, I think I was 15 years old and I attended a leadership summit that was hosted by the university. Like many people, fell in love with the campus immediately and decided that's really where I wanted to go. Put the pieces together with an Air Force ROTC scholarship, and then matriculated there, as a freshman. And I knew right away that I was going to be in a very technical field because my scholarship was in computer science. But the combination that you find at Redlands of the focus on sociology and philosophy and the arts combined with the technical, I didn't know it at the time, but it certainly was a foray into what I'm doing now. Very little of what I do now is on the technical side, and I rely heavily on the foundational components that Redlands provided to put together the pieces that really make cyber strategy. So it's I guess, partly by design, part serendipity, but the pieces really came together with Redlands at the foundation to kind of lead to where we are right now.
So we have a couple of questions coming in. First, what was the most influential class you had during your time at Redlands?
Let's see, the most influential class. I took an intro to philosophy class, and it was one of those, foundational liberal arts core requirements. I had absolutely no background in philosophy, and frankly, before that, no interest in the but and I think that really is a testament to an 18-year-old who is trying to kind of figure out how the world works, being kind of guided into that type of an opportunity or an environment was a gift that has continued to pay dividends. My graduate work in several different places and my professional work now is built on those foundational lessons that I learned in that class about how society hangs together and what causes conflict and where people generally fall out both as individuals and as groups. So I credit the school for not only, of course, the great foundation that is the Redlands education, but also just the fact that you can tie together so many disciplines in a way that forces people to expand their horizons.
All right, so while I was doing some of the research for the interview, I was just looking at everything that I could about your bio and everything, and just some interesting things kept popping up. But I think someone else could maybe ask this question better. So I'm going to let someone on the back end help us out and play this question for you. So I'll get your reaction.
Let's mix in a curveball. Right down the middle. Why was world history since 1450 your favorite class of all time?
Oh, how did I know we were going to have a cameo of our Kelsey Myers in this? I wouldn't have doubted it for a second. To his point about our class on world history, my dear friend Kelsey Myers and I spent a lot of time in that class, and we spent a lot of time talking about how the world hangs together, like I talked about, and it was a pretty formative experience. So I'm glad to see my brother out there. He told me, he didn't tell me why, but he told me he broke the neighbor's vase across the way. So anything that gets billed from that, send it straight back to Kelsey Myers because it's his fault.
Okay, fair enough. But if that surprise wasn't enough, we have one more surprise. So let's get your reaction to this question after we play it for you.
Four-seam fastball right here. Strike three. Wondering if you can tell me why we can't get free oyster crackers in the cafeteria anymore.
Everyone has college stories that need to remain just that, and so maybe on that one we'll just leave the oyster cracker discussion to another time. Thanks, Kelly.
You're gonna leave us with that? Come on, this is on the hot seat here. You got to answer the questions.
I already did answer the question, Evan.
All right, fair enough. So let's talk about baseball. That's where you met Kelsey. So what was baseball like at Redlands?
So I was never a good baseball player. I guess good enough to hang on to a pretty extraordinary group of guys and playing there as a Bulldog for 4 years. And so that's something that I will eternally be grateful for, both the opportunity to compete at the Yard, but also for the amazing group of friends that have endured for the last 2 decades, right? I can tell you that there have been instances in my military career where I have depended upon the experiences I gained on the mound as a pitcher in ways I never anticipated. When bullets are literally flying and you say to yourself, this is no pressure. I've been here before because I faced Pomona in the 7th inning of a tied game. You start to realize that those lessons extend beyond the sport, right? So some of my most dear friends and experiences have really been at the foundational core of everything we're doing.
Wow, well, I think we have to end it there. What a great way to end the interview. I hope you and your family stay safe. And thanks for joining us, Billy, and also all of you that have joined us today. I'm really glad we're bringing this show back, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next time. Stay safe and healthy out there, everybody, and I hope I'll see you soon.